Who is excited about reining in them high yields from Airbnbs? Hello property navigators. Welcome to today's video where we delve into a crucial question we are asked all the time by property investors. Should you Airbnb your investment property to generate high yields, or is sticking to traditional long-term rental leases the better option? I'm Luke, and in this episode we'll dissect the appealing prospects and potential pitfalls of Airbnb. If you're pondering over the Airbnb allure or considering it as a strategic move in your property investment journey, this discussion is tailored for you. Firstly, let's explore the tempting advantages of Airbnb. The most striking pro is undoubtedly the higher potential yields. While the average yield for residential properties in Australia hovers between 3 and 4%, Airbnb can offer a whopping 10 to 15% and even higher in some cases. This difference is not just substantial, it's a game changer, potentially fast-tracking your path to financial independence. Additionally, Airbnb provides unparalleled flexibility. You choose to rent out your property during peak seasons or live in it during the off-peak times. This adaptability is something traditional rentals don't offer, making Airbnb an attractive option for many. However, as with most silver linings, there can be a cloud. There are significant downsides to Airbnb that are often overlooked. The first major con is the banking sector's hesitance to consider Airbnb income for borrowing capacity. Banks typically need 12 to 24 months of rental statements, and even then may only consider 20 to 40% of income generated from Airbnb when assessing your serviceability. Now, this can severely limit your borrowing power for your future investments. Cash flow is your lifeblood as an investor, so having a limited capacity to borrow can really screw things up for you in the long term if you don't plan around it from the very start. Obviously, if finance isn't a problem, then you're all good there. Next up, we have the political and regulatory risks, and these can't be ignored. With increasing restrictions on Airbnb in many regions and states, your investment could be vulnerable to policy changes, and we've seen some of the states here in Australia start to clamp down on short-term rentals that are limiting the supply of housing for people to live in. Now, you need to keep an eye on this particular point as we move into the future, because Australia's rental crisis is the topic on the tip of everybody's tongue at the moment. The shockingly high, rapid rise of rents and how it is fueling the inflation figure, which is causing interest rates to rise. Everyone blames so-called greedy landlords or governments for failing to build enough public housing, but have a look at this graph. We all love Airbnb, except if you own a competing hotel or motel. But is Airbnb taking all the rental properties and causing a huge spike in rents for long-term tenants? Well, this comparison of Airbnb rentals versus long-term rentals available on the market shows that Airbnb rentals have decimated our long-term rental housing supply over the last 5 or so years. There's 2 things I want to point out here that you should watch out for. Firstly, as I've already mentioned, policy will continue to be updated to build greater governance around Airbnb short stays. So you will be at the whim as to what these changes encompass over time. Whatever they will look like, we don't know yet. And secondly, this market is becoming much more cluttered, with more competing short-term rentals appearing on Airbnb than ever before, which this in itself can dilute profits and make gaining patronage for your Airbnb more difficult. You also must consider the costs associated with Airbnb because they are so much higher. You have platform fees, higher insurance premiums, cleaning fees, initial setup costs for your furnishings, and there's also substantial property management fees. Now, these expenses can significantly erode the attractive yields from Airbnb stays. Lastly, the occupancy rate is a critical factor. You will need to be achieving a consistent occupancy rate above 70%. Now, this is challenging and requires meticulous planning and market understanding. The dynamic nature of the Airbnb market demands ongoing attention. Unlike more static traditional rentals, there's really not much use in trading off a 5% yield over a full year for a 10% yield, but for only half the year, as it works out to be the same actual amount, but with much more work involved. Now, also remember back to our first point, you are losing serviceability in finance to keep building out your portfolio. You really need to weigh that up. Now, after considering these factors, my personal stance leans away from Airbnb purely for investment properties. The initial lure of higher yields diminishes when you factor in the additional costs, risks, and efforts required. For many investors' portfolios, the stability and predictability of traditional rentals align better with their investment strategies. However, this doesn't rule out Airbnb as a viable option for those willing to invest the time and manage the properties themselves, especially if they are targeting a smaller number of properties and are passionate about customer service. But is there a better way? Well, before we wrap up, let's discuss the hybrid Airbnb model. Now, this approach merges the benefits of traditional renting and Airbnb together, potentially offering a solution to combat rising interest rates and costs of living. Now, this is a really great option for those that are into their first property and want to start building out their portfolio with more access to cash. Imagine you own a 2-story property. The hybrid Airbnb model allows you to live on one part of the property, say upstairs, and list the other part, like an independent living area, downstairs on Airbnb. So the strategy not only provides you with a personal living space, but also taps into the lucrative short-term rental Airbnb market. Now, this extra income can be a strategic move to making your investment more resilient and financially viable. The key takeaways here include increased yield, because by utilizing part of your property for Airbnb, you're likely to earn more than traditional renting, thus boosting your overall cash flow. 2. Risk mitigation. This model provides a cushion against the unpredictability of the rental market. If Airbnb demands fluctuate, you still have a portion of the property for personal use or traditional renting. And 3. Personal flexibility. It offers you the flexibility to use or rent out different parts of your property as per your personal and financial needs. You can also take on the cleaning role, changing beds, etc., rather than having to outsource that stuff because you are actually living at the property. Implementing the hybrid Airbnb model requires careful consideration of local regulations, investment goals, and personal lifestyle preferences. However, when executed well, it can be a strategic approach to maximize your property's potential, especially in times of economic uncertainty like rising interest rates. Imagine the impact that earning an extra $5,000 to $10,000 per year over the next 10 or 15 years would make on your cash flow. To finish up on this topic, I want to touch on the tax implications of Airbnb, because there's some things for an investor that are important to know. But remember, this isn't financial advice, so you should speak to a good accountant before pulling the trigger on anything in particular. So obviously, rental income from rents and fees you charge for using your property form part of your assessable income for tax purposes, so you need to declare it when you lodge your tax return. You can, however, claim deductions for expenses incurred on the property, so you may be able to offset some of the tax liability. Tax deductible expenses include things like mortgage interest, repairs and maintenance costs, listing service fees, among other things, insurance premiums. You should note, though, that if you decide to rent out only a part of your property using the hybrid model, you need to apportion the deductions you can claim and limit your claim to the expenses you incur in renting out that specific space. And this is the part that I really personally like, because essentially you can write off the expenses for setting up your second independent living area. To make things easy to navigate in the scenario of using the hybrid model, the ATO has divided the tax deductions you can claim into 3 categories. Number 1, expenses associated directly with the rental area. Right, so this would include items such as the depreciation on the furniture and equipment used in the room, Airbnb commissions, and costs for advertising the property. Investors can deduct these expenses in full because they're directly related to the Airbnb portion of the property. Number 2, expenses associated with the rental area and the private area that need to be apportioned. Now, this is important. This would include expenses that you incur privately and as a landlord. For example, if your Airbnb might need to share a bathroom with you in the private residence, or they might have access to an outdoor entertainment area or a swimming pool. Now, the ATO allows you to claim a deduction for these expenses to the extent that they relate to the Airbnb use. And number 3, expenses associated with private areas that only the host can access. Now, this would include expenses that relate only to the portions of the property that you and your family use. Like other owner-occupiers, you can't claim a tax deduction for these expenses because you're not generating any income from the portion of the property. Another huge takeaway here for investors is the effect that capital gains tax will have on your profits if using your whole or portion of your property for short-term rental. How do capital gains taxes apply to the sale of an Airbnb? Well, when you sell an asset for more than you paid for it, you're said to have made a capital gain. If the asset is something you own for personal use, like your own home, any capital gain you make is tax-free thanks to the main resident exemption. But if you sell a rental property, you may have to pay capital gains tax. As with income tax, different capital gains tax rules apply depending on whether you rent the entire property out or Airbnb only a portion of it. Number 1, CGT rules where the entire property is rented out. If you rent out the entire investment property on Airbnb, you'll have to pay capital gains tax on all of the profit proceeds. Fortunately, the ATO does allow Airbnb investors to be exempt from paying CGT in certain circumstances, so you will want to check that out with your accountant. And number 2, CGT rules where only a portion of the property is rented out. So if you rent out a part of your home on Airbnb, you'll no longer be able to claim the full main residence exemption. Instead, you'll pay capital gains tax on the sale proceeds according to the portion of the property that you have rented out. In other words, you'll only be able to claim a partial main residence exemption. So a big nugget of advice here. You want to check this out in detail. Talk to a good accountant or financial planner. You want to make sure that you aren't trading off the allure of high short-term cash flow now for your full capital gains later, because the capital gains tax you might pay may far outweigh the extra cash flow you've made in the short term. And that's why we need a well thought out plan and strategy. Remember, before ever making a property investment decision, you need to clearly know why it is you're going to be buying what you are buying. So if you are considering buying a property solely for Airbnb purposes, you need to ask yourself, is this purchase driven by the requirement for the best short-term lifestyle rental market? Is that what you want in it? Are you, as a potential investor, considering the location's full investment potential? Has the market you're buying into recently had huge growth and not going to sit flat? You need to know these things. You should ask yourself, what is this type of dwelling being considered for? Because a unit will have a much lower probability of outperforming an established property in the same location in regards to capital growth. Ensure you weigh up these key investment attributes, because if a portfolio needs more capital growth, you may be steering the ship down the wrong path if you're thinking of buying a cheaper unit just to Airbnb it. As always, keep exploring innovative strategies to stay ahead of the property investment game. Share your thoughts on this hybrid model and how you see it fitting into your investment portfolio. And don't forget to subscribe and tune in every Thursday for our new videos. Until next time, happy property navigating.